Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay.
Yes. Bom dia a tothom.
Good morning. Welcome to this talk with Steve Erikson. I'm going to give a brief introduction of him and his work for those that don't know him. And later we will continue in English our conversation. Steve Erikson has written a saga of Malaysian books of the Fallen series. And he's written plenty of books, not only Malaysian books. There are the Kirkanis trilogy, the prequel, the sequel, Watchland. So all around 22 books in this universe. With a co-author, INC Esselman, who's written also in this universe. So it's a quite rich universe that living for more than 20 years. He's written sci-fi, he's writing also some essays. We'll talk about it because it's very, very interesting. And when he started writing, he used to play RPGs. He is an archaeologist and anthropologist as a background. This is something that can be clearly seen in the Malaysian books. I know that you're here to listen to him, not to me, so we will move into English.
Some discussions, because I came to listen to you, not to me. So let's start from the beginning, the origins of Malaz. You've said several times in several interviews that it all started with a role-playing game.
It did.
Together with Ian, right? Because you were dissatisfied with the role-playing game at the time, rules, how it was like very not free will-ish because of all those rules. So you started like breaking the rules to make your own game in a way. So could you tell us a little bit about that process also, so everybody can know like where all Malaz and stuff started brewing in a way?
Okay. Well, we met, myself and Ian Eslamont, we met on an archaeology dig in northwest Ontario. And we hit it off fairly early because we were sharing a tent, so we had no choice. And eventually, Cam was interested in writing, and I was already in a writing program at the time. So we ended up at the same university, University of Victoria. Should I stop there and let you translate?
No, they're doing it.
Oh, it's all being done, is it?
Yeah.
Nice. Okay. And we started, so we shared a flat in Victoria, and we started gaming quite early on. But it was late for me. I'd never gamed before, so I was I guess early 20s, maybe mid 20s. And I guess because we were both writers, what interested us in the role-playing games was the narrative. So it was not what we used to call Monty Hall campaigns, which is the campaign where you simply go and kill all the bad guys and get the loot, and then you move on to the next campaign and do the same thing. We fell away from that very, very quickly. And quite often we had, I mean, it was unusual gaming in that it was one person was playing multiple characters and the other person was running the game. So we would have entire gaming sessions that were nothing but conversations between characters. So the rules don't really matter at that point. But we eventually found GURPS, Steve Jackson's generic universal role-playing system. So we moved away from AD&D, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And the GURPS system is a much more freewheeling system. And so we found that much more to our liking. And so that's how sort of the games started developing from there.
I mean, nowadays, and I wanted to start with role-playing game, because nowadays role-playing and video games and games are a multi-billionaire industry. It's also pop culture. Everybody has played or will play any kind of game. But back in the days, that was obscure, let's call it.
Very obscure, yeah. I mean, even the gaming clubs at the university, they were always in some small room that smelled bad. So, people hid their love of role-playing games. Yeah.
Yeah, and also, how was also the fact of like approaching some years after this, like a publishing house or a studio or a producer, like, hey, I made a script based on a role-playing game. I know there's these things on TV about satanists and cults and whatever, but you know, we made a nice book. Like there was a lot of rejection, a lot of bias.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, we never would have pitched that the film script for Gardens of the Moon was based on a role-playing game. I mean, they would have thrown us out of the office right there. As it was, they threw us out of the office 5 minutes later because it was a fantasy story, and nobody was interested in filming fantasy.
Yeah, nowadays we got releases in like big Hollywood productions as Dungeons of Dragons, right? Which is like a big change in a very short span of time. So I actually wanted to ask you about I've read in an interview sometimes they explain about this first game you had with Ian. Mm-hmm. There's like a funny story around that.
Oh, should I tell that story?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The first game we played was kind of a trial game, and it was at the dig. So if you have to imagine, we were camped on the side of a lake. So there were sort of tents in the forest, maybe 4 tents, small crew, and we had this picnic table with a cook tent over it. And so we decided that we were going to run this game. And so the other archaeologists, none of whom had played any kind of role-playing games, it was just Cam. So he had us roll up our characters. And our boss, named Richard, can't remember the character he rolled up, but he insisted on getting the biggest shield possible, like giant shield. And I think I have to acknowledge that there was some illicit drugs involved. So some of the players were a bit wasted. And so he set up a very, very early campaign where there's like 3 or 4 of us in the forest and a number of wolves come to attack us. So we could practice rolling and using weapons and all that kind of stuff. And it turned into complete disaster. Richard, he took his shield, and because it was so big, he just hid under it. That's all he did. My character threw all his weapons away and climbed a tree. And I think the other character attempted to stab the NPC in the back. And the character was a halfling, so he's just tiny. And the NPC was like 6'6". And so the attempt to stab got the NPC in the shin, or in the calf, right? Completely useless. At which point Cam just sort of threw up his hands and said, "Go away, we're not doing this anymore." So that was our first horrible gaming effort. But later on, Cam and I, as we were sharing a flat, we just did a lot of gaming, way too much gaming. But it built the Malazan world.
Yeah, and exactly that. I wanted to actually connect that because I know nowadays, 2023, when we speak about a fantasy author that translates his role-playing game parties into a novel, we're like, okay, another one, right? It's kind of a very normalized thing nowadays, but back in the days, probably not. So how was that process together with Ian, like sharing a flat, I guess, and like writing the characters one by one, the scenarios, like amplifying like those maps, like hand draw that you have with him that are like on the internet, right?
Yeah, I still have all the maps.
Yeah. So how was that process together with him? It was like every game you will like take notes, like this could be interesting for something else.
To some extent, we alternated. So we alternated in terms of DM. So we had 2 campaigns running in parallel. One of the campaigns involved Cam's works, so the Crimson Guard and that kind of thing. And then my campaigns involved the Bridge Burners and the early campaigns before the events of Gardens of the Moon. So all of what we gamed was actually the backstory to what became the novels, because we did not initially want to be bound to what happened in the games. So that's the back history. And then when the novels pick up, they pick up the story And we're allowed then to create completely new stuff, independent stuff, based on that shared history of the gaming.
And now let's make a kind of a jump thematically and in time, because we're talking about early days, young guys just having fun with some games. And then we go to two archaeologists and anthropologists creating an extremely vast world. And when I say vast, I'm being euphemist. Multi-layer world where you explore the biggest themes in literature and so on. So what was the moment you said like, oh, this is going to be a 10-book series and then a prequel and then a sequel and then a 6-book series parallel to it? Like that shift was like organically going? Was more like after the rejection of the script for TV?
It was after the rejection of the script. We actually wrote two. We still have one called Black Dog Blues, which is a screenplay set in the north of Pale. So it was that campaign. And yeah, we still have that one floating around. But yeah, we had already sold a couple of feature film scripts, but we weren't getting anywhere with the fantasy stuff. And we were in a writing program that was not interested in certainly any kind of genre. So we were writing short stories. But we decided when he went off to get his master's in Alaska, and I went off to get my master's in writing in Iowa, that since we weren't in the same place, we'd have to sort of independently write books set in this world. But we took with us, I mean, everything we'd learned in the writing programs. And so I approached this as if I was writing the world's longest short story. And that's kind of how it came out.
So that would be the structure of each book, like one short story per chapter, more or less, right?
One short story per scene sometimes,
Per scene.
yeah. Yeah,
because
so there's a looping structure to each of those setup scenes, and then it loops into the chapter, and then it loops into the book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4 within the novel, and so it's always elliptical, and so that makes it more manageable, because if you think, oh, I'm going to start on page 1 of the first book, and I'm not going to finish until I've written 3.25 million words, I mean, that's so intimidating. You can't do it.
I mean, your books are intimidating. You
Well,
see them printed,
yeah, but
right?
they don't. When you're writing it, they don't feel that way, because you're writing a discrete little scene, and all you have to do is complete the scene, and then when it's done, you can move on to the next scene.
Let's do another question about the intimidation, about the size of the books, not just the world. We will get that in a bit. But like, what would you say to a person that comes like to you with the first book? It's like, Stephen, like this is very intimidating. Like, how would you say like no, but it's not because? What would that?
I would
be?
ask them if they've read Frank Herbert's Dune, because I basically lifted the structure of Dune for Gardens of the Moon. It's the same. So if you're familiar with science fiction, and if you're familiar with political thrillers, for example, nothing in Gardens of the Moon should be intimidating, because it's very, very similar. Because I was reading all that kind of stuff. I didn't just read fantasy.
I mean, the thing that every new reader knows is that Guardians of the Moon starts in media res, in the middle of a huge conflict that's been going on, that will be going on, but we're just thrown there, right?
Yep.
Why that decision?
Why?
Yeah, like why would you say like, oh,
Well,
this is
because,
gonna be fun.
as I explained earlier, the gaming was the history that precedes all of that. So we had that in our minds. It was already there. So, and the other thing is, AD&D, for example, when you roll up a character, you start at level 1. And so you kind of create this artificial timidity for all of these characters, because any scenario they get into, they're outgunned, generally. GURPS, you can roll up a character who's a 130-point character who's already a veteran and has all these skills. So if you think of that in terms of the novels, these are characters who already have their history and their backstories when they step onto the page. And that just sort of allows you to sort of pick up the story at the run and go, as opposed to a lot of expositional info dumping to begin with.
Because, and now I want to trace some analogies towards archaeology and
Okay.
anthropology, because as we said, there's a lot of back history like sometimes gets hinted, sometimes just gets like commented by some characters, and sometimes it's just there, and it is, and it will never be told in a way.
No.
But also like this story will continue, although it's not written, right? Like it
Yep.
feels very organic. It feels like there's a huge timeline there.
Yeah.
Is this like also something to do with your work as anthropologist and archaeologist, where there's multi-layers, there's huge background in history, in culture, interchanging? So how that influenced your work?
Looking back on it, I think the fact that Cam and I were both archaeologists has directly informed how we wrote this series. In archaeology, you tend to, you arrive at a place and you see the surface landscape, and it's on that surface that the story is going to take place. But the landscape itself is something that has been shaped by history, and quite often it's been shaped not just by geological or geographical forces, but by human activity. I remember flying in and flying over the UK the first time, and looking down on the landscape as the plane was coming down, and realizing that everything I looked at had been shaped by humans. That was a completely different landscape from what we knew of in Canada, where you scrape the surface and you've left human history behind. So we had that sense of deep time that is part of what the archaeologist is interested in. And of course, when you're excavating, you're only discovering remnants of entire lives and entire generations of people living in a different culture. So you have a lot of blanks, a lot of spaces to fill, and with a fantasy world, you just use the imagination to fill those spaces. So it's very much an archaeological style of writing, because there are things under the surface, and they've given shape to everything on the surface. If that makes sense.
Like a fantasy world will allow you also to, because archaeology is like you will use scientific methods to try and fill those blanks. You can just like make it up, right? But in fantasy world,
yeah, no, we make it up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Trust me.
Science. But in the fantasy world, you can make it up. You can kind of seem off that frustration in a way. So how does the fantasy, writing a fantasy book, a fantasy world with so many similarities to our real world in terms of deep history and so on, allows you to like recreate that feeling, but at the same time like make it your own?
Yeah, well, it's the mundane details that are informed by studying anthropology, archaeology, all the rest, and that provides what's called what we would call verisimilitude. So you get that sense of the familiar, and once you've laid out that sense of the familiar, you can then build the unfamiliar on top of that, because everybody understands what a street is. Everybody understands what a room is, or a torch, or a sword, or all these mundane things. And once you build beyond that, then you're in the realm of the thing that fantasy as a genre can do better than any other genre, which is to take a metaphor and make it real. And so that was one of the things that we were thinking about a lot when we were creating this world, that we could address issues of the modern world and engage in a kind of dialogue between the book and the real world, in which we took elements from the real world at that time and turned them into metaphors for the fantasy world. One of the ones we wanted to do, explore, was what would happen if magic was real, right? If it had efficacious effects. And the first thing that occurred to both of us was that if magic is acquired on the basis of merit, so it's not based on birthright or gender or anything along those lines, then there's all these elements of social structure in any culture that are altered by the presence of magic. So if you think of a medieval culture or peasant-based style culture, the women would be expected to produce 6, 7, 8 children in the hopes that 1 or 2 would survive to adulthood. If you have magic where healing can actually bring those first 2 children into adulthood through healing, suddenly you've removed this immense burden from one half of the gender. And so we realized that with magic in this form that we were just defining it as, we would have a world without sexism, because even the physical prowess and threat imposed by men over women is now in question, because that woman could gesture and eviscerate the man, right? So everything changes in terms of the culture. And we wanted to explore that in depth, because it was a world without sexism.
Let's touch upon just very briefly about magic before we continue on culture, because I think this is a very interesting topic. But regarding magic, one of the most discussed things by readers of your books is like how difficult it is to give a sense to the magic that happens in the world per se, because it's very vague in a way. There's many ways for the characters to draw upon it, to use it. And also I wanted to so the question would be like, what is magic for you in a fantasy novel, or how do you think it should be? Also in opposition to modern trends, you could say, where everything is very systemized, like like a set of rules and so on. And
I would probably offend all the Brandon Sanderson fans out here, but magic systems to me is an oxymoron. The purpose of magic as it arose in literature, so in legends, tall tales, and mythology, is that the role of magic in those stories is to evoke a sense of wonder, but also a sense of mystery, that there is elements of the universe that are simply beyond our ability to explain, but they have an impact upon us. If you systematize it, you've basically reduced it to mechanistic technology, in which case it's simply an alternative to technology. And that defeats the purpose of magic in literature. So we never wanted to have magic fully explained. It's integral to the cultures. Their avenue, their pathway into that magic can be unique for each of those cultures. But they're taken as a given. And I think it's easy to imagine that our modern Western sensibilities of an ordered mechanistic universe without mystery is the norm. It's not. It's extremely unique. It's unusual. Most cultures throughout time have integrated a sense of the magic or the supernatural into its defining features. And so in the Malazian world, every culture takes magic as a given, but it's not necessarily fully understood. So you learn how to use what you can, but there's always a cost when you do so. We're not interested in explaining too much of the magic system. It's there, it's in the background. Cam and I both sort of operate upon those rules, but we don't feel it's our job to lay out the specifics of those things. It'd be the equivalent of Homer's The Iliad, pausing every now and then to give you an info dump on why the gods showed up. It's just not done, right? It's not done in that stuff. So why would we do it now?
So then, and going back to culture, but following this thread, which is the Iliad and so on, it's like, and also like talking about blank spaces in archaeology, like is cultures trying to fill those blank spaces with mythology, legends, and stories that they tell each other, but also because culture, I guess, is not just like a set of things, it's like, it's alive in a way, and it mixes.
Yeah.
How does culture play a strong role in building the Malazian world?
Well, that's one of the areas where both Cam and I, we found it frustrating to read a lot of fantasy and epic fantasy in particular. You had a sense that there was a cyclical kind of notion to it. So kind of a closed system where at the end of the story, you've basically reaffirm the status quo that was threatened by the story. So you've got your opening scenes of a novel or whatever, of a trilogy, where you have a certain status quo is established. You have the farm boys, you have the nobility, you have all these things. And then there's an external threat, the Dark Lord. Whatever version of Dark Lord you want, is now going to threaten that status quo. And so what often happens in these stories is that status quo is put under threat by the Dark Lord. The heroes rise up and defeat the Dark Lord, basically bury the Dark Lord all over again, and we return to the status quo. So there's no sense of cultures in evolution or cultures in transition. There's no sense of things are moving on beyond that point, because the next trilogy resurrects the Dark Lord and you do it all over again. So we were certainly interested in writing a fantasy series that was dynamic and constantly evolving. So that's one of the reasons why in Gardens of the Moon, the very first book, you're seeing military strategies are actually evolving through the use of alchemical munitions. So something new has arrived and it's changing things. And anthropology is all about cultures in transition, cultures in contact with each other, and the effects that those things have. And of course, growing up in North America, we had all around us examples of what happens when one culture impacts another culture and attempts to displace it. So those are the kinds of things that interested us.
There's actually a thing when readers start Gardens of the Moon, which is like they're expecting like this epic fantasy, swords, warriors, magic, whatever, and then what they get thrown upon is like a freaking huge battle, explosions, magicians getting obliterated, a floating castle-ish that throws lasers in a way, and like a big conflict where the ones that actually are dominating are like kind of politicians and generals, not so much like the powerful Dark Lord and the magician in a way. So this is a big contrast, and we're talking about a book that's, I don't want to use the word old, but you know, it was published, like Gardens of the Moon was published some
1999, and it took 8 years to find a publisher.
Yeah.
So
So let's say that it was like a breakthrough compared to the status quo of the fantasy at the time.
But to me, it's almost implicit from the gaming, because we discovered early on that I think most fantasy game systems, they have to impose a lot of limitations on magic, because magic is overpowering. It's overpowering for your average character. So we wanted a non-magical means of leveling the playing field. And that's where the munitions, the alchemical munitions, came in, where you could take out your Dark Lord with a grenade. And that was interesting, because then everybody has the ability to affect huge changes in the world, no matter where they are in terms of their social status.
Is there any early on writer that inspired you to take this non-Tolkien stream of?
Well, there are two streams, I think, to modern fantasy, and one is the Tolkien epic fantasy route, and the other one is sword and sorcery, which is, if you think of Robert E. Howard, Fritz Leiber, Karl Edward Wagner, these are the origins of grimdark. That's where it starts, basically, and that arises out of the pulp tradition, which in turn arises out of noir. So there's a very different, there's kind of two parallel tracks that only converge towards maybe the last 30 years, 40 years, where you can bring in sword and sorcery elements into the epic format. So both Cam and I, we grew up as fans of Conan and Robert E. Howard, rather than fans of Tolkien. Sorry if that offends anybody, but it just wasn't our bag. So the sword and sorcery stuff, it's on a much more human scale in many respects.
I also wanted to ask you about the Malaz and regarding Grindan, because usually it gets defined as a grimdark series.
Yeah, it's not grimdark at all.
I was gonna ask, like,
Yeah.
is there like, because there's a lot of death, there's a lot of violence, ultra violence, there's a lot of war, there's a lot of betrayals, and it's very harsh to be a peasant in the Malazan world, because you're gonna
Sure.
get caught in the middle of all this.
Yeah.
Probably. So is that, would you say there's hope in Malazan, and opposed to
Yeah,
grimdark?
and that's what makes it distinguished from grimdark for sure. In a general sense, from what I have observed of grimdark, is there's a nihilistic element to it. So there's almost a revelry of the violence, and I often wonder if it didn't come from a lot of the superhero films that were appearing around the same time or just beforehand, where you had that sense of your superhero was almost sociopathic in some respects. You know, they would walk out of the burning building and look cool doing it, even though, you know, 50 henchmen have just died and their wives, you know, their husbands aren't coming home that day. And it didn't matter for the hero. And I think that sort of spilled over into a lot of the fiction, where the violence almost becomes the reason for writing it. And I think both Cam and I had a huge aversion to that. We wanted to explore the consequences of violence, the things you have to live with as a consequence to these things. And of course, we'd both been reading Vietnam War literature at the time. And that, again, is on a very human scale. And then when we saw Glenn Cook do the Black Company stuff, and Glenn Cook being a Vietnam War veteran, we saw this extraordinary fusion of Vietnam War literature with fantasy, and it just blew our minds. So that was a huge inspiration for us.
So talking about writing and structure and so on, Malazan generally is, or maybe 100%, but it's told by POVs, like points of view of characters, right? But there's certain main characters that never have a POD.
No.
So, for example, Commander Rake, which is one of the most maybe famous or recognizable ones. Could you tell us like, why did you chose to do this, and why early on you kept doing it?
Accidentally. It was actually accidental. One of my early drafts of Gardens of the Moon attempted Commander Rake's point of view, and I realized I could not pull that off with any kind of authenticity, because this was a character who is 200,000-300,000 years old. There's no way that I could create the verisimilitude I needed for that character. So I basically pushed him off the stage. And then in order to bring that character into the story, it would always be through the points of view of lesser characters, if you will, mortal, normal characters. And that's what sort of builds up the mythos of Commander Rake, is that he's held at a distance. In fact, the first time you see him, he shows up on a ledge on Moonspawn, this tiny figure. And so when the book came out and people were starting to respond to it online, I was absolutely stunned to see that everybody loved Commander Rake. And I thought, well, that's weird. I mean, it's the only guy without a point of view, right? So I had to think about that a lot, and then basically concluded that it's the very act of keeping that character at a distance that elevates that character. And once I realized that that was the case, then I could choose certain characters within the series whose point of view I would never approach, and that would have a consequence for the reader. And so Commander Rake was the accidental one, but the ones that followed, like Tavor, that was very deliberate. And I think it works. Yeah.
I would like to ask you two more short questions, and then if we have time, we can maybe get one question from you guys. Talking about writing, you said many times on Facebook that you are writing a book about writing.
Yeah.
How's that going?
Not too bad. Not too bad. I should be finished by the spring, I think. Yeah. It will also be The middle section of it is holding almost all the essays that I've been writing and posting on Facebook.
Is there like one advice in that book that you can share with us?
Sure, finish what you start. It's so easy to start, and then once it gets difficult, you slide off and get a new idea and take off on that one, and then it gets difficult, and then you slide off and take on everything you've done, and up to that hard point, you already know how to do. You've already learned how to do that. It's when it gets to the hard part and you start sweating out every word and you're bleeding all over the keyboard, that's your learning process. So.
And then talking about that book, that's the first book of the Malaz sequel. Can you tell us a bit more about the future of the series? Because you finished the 10, like the decalogy, the main storyline. But now you're doing a sequel. You also started a prequel. That's also a trilogy.
Yep.
So is that going to be it?
I suspect it is, yeah. I know Cam is he's bringing the story all the way up to the Siege of Pale, I think is his idea. So a lot of what Eslamant's writing right now is the stuff we gamed, which is a lot of fun to look at.
So he still remembers from back in the day?
Well, no, we're both hopeless on that. We have to have conversations on what we remembered. And the irony is, he's left-handed and I'm right-handed, and so we remember things completely differently. In terms of placement and all that kind of stuff, it just drives us crazy.
Yeah. So one tiny more question about that, because you said it in many interviews that it was actually very relieving. So what was your feeling when you closed this book and you sent it to your editor and was like, I'm done, like I'm finished? And then some years later, like, hey, could you write more?
No, I'd already signed, I think by the time I was writing book 9, I signed contracts for 2 more trilogies.
Okay.
So I was a little bit nervous about just sort of having no contract signed when I finished the series, because the series has been strange in a way. I mean, if you think about it, I finished the last book at least, 20 years ago, 10 years ago? It's all blurring out. But the initial response of each book when they came out was fairly tepid. It was lukewarm. And I'd never anticipated that the readership would continue to the extent that it has, or that BookTube would arrive and sort of resurrect the series for modern readers. So I really wanted that contract signed and in place, so I had some kind of security, a sense of security. So that's why by the 9th book, I think I was already committed to the 2 trilogies.
Okay. So I think if anybody has a question, otherwise I have a bunch more. So I don't know if someone wants to ask anything. Raise your hand. Oh, okay.
Long-time fan. One of the themes in Latter Malaz, I think, is translation and the loss of language throughout the series. It's such a big universe, such a long story. For example, the word Chevlor from House of Chains is derived, and loss of meaning is an important part. I wanted to ask you about the translation of your books, if you have any input on it, because I don't know if you noticed, for example, in Spanish, Dust of Dreams and Creeper God were not very well translated. So if you go from Toll the Hounds to Dust of Dreams, there's apparently new characters, which names have been over-translated again. I don't know if this excites you as new stories being told, your books have been gathering new meaning, or you have any input over, okay, please, guys, don't do it like this, don't destroy the meaning which was already there.
Well, first of all, I have no idea what the translations are doing, right? Because I don't read these other languages. But I have, in terms of character names and that kind of stuff, there's very little input. And I know when the audio people, like Michael Page and stuff, I was never contacted by Michael on pronunciation of character names. So his pronunciations are all over the place compared to what mine would be. And so I learned early on not to worry about it. However they're pronounced is fine with me. Later on, I know for the translator for this one and for the Carcanis books, or rather the audio, individuals, they contacted me and we went over a huge list for the character names. So they would be consistent with what I had in mind. But generally, no, I don't hear from the translators. Yep.
Actually, is there any other question?
Hola, Steven. Gracias por estar aquí.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you so much for being with us today. Well, taking into account the huge success of all your fantasy saga and all the adaptations such as Game of Thrones and The Witcher, are you thinking about creating a new adaptation? Do you think maybe in getting the licenses?
I don't know if you have any plans to adapt Malaz into an audiovisual media.
Right. Well, as you know, there's been a strike. There's been a strike in Hollywood, writer's strike, and then an actor's strike. The only thing I can tell you is there is a conversation that's ongoing at the moment for an adaptation. So, but I won't be able to announce anything until I'm able to announce it. So.
I don't know if we have more time. There's any?
Yeah, over here, on your left, I think. Yeah, on your left here.
Oh, okay.
So, sorry. My question would be like in the prologue of the at least Spanish version of the Gardens of the Moon. One thing that like really struck me was that as the ideas as a young writer trying to do something really ambitious, like something different, and this idea of you as a young writer trying to make something. So my question would be like, what would you like now that you're an accomplished writer, and what would you tell to the youngest writers trying to do like what you had with Malaz, this idea of let's make something big, something ambitious, something huge. Like what would you be? I don't know if your recommendation or your like now that you're crossed that bridge of making something meaningful. What would you say to that new generation of young fantasy writers?
Well, I don't know if the Spanish edition has the. I wrote an introduction. Is that in the book?
I think that's the introduction.
Yeah. Okay. So not the prologue, but the introduction.
Ah, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Introduction.
Yeah?
Sorry.
Pretty much what I said there is don't be afraid of ambition. Just go, push it as far as you can, because that's where you're going to learn. It's also where you, as a writer, where you learn humility, because if you stay safe, you don't push beyond almost your abilities. You can easily end up writing the same story over and over again, which can be very successful. I mean, there's many authors who do that. So yeah, be ambitious, and don't let people talk you out of that ambition.
Thanks.
Val, crec que ho deixarem.
All right, I think that's a wrap. Well, I think that Stephen will be outside signing books on the right side. Let's give him a very big applause. Thank you so much.